Back when I was in high school, I had a history teacher who was I just had a lot of good history teachers over the years. And this particular teacher, every so often, he would just say, okay, class, put your pencils down. You're not going to be tested on this. And he would launch into this 5, 10, 15-minute story. And you'd never quite sure what you'd get. It was always related to what the topic was, but you might get the Transcontinental Railroad, you might get the Franco-Prussian War. You just get some history-related story. And you'd walk out of class that day and you'd be like, I know I learned something, but I'm not sure what. And it kind of gave me a real appreciation for history, just the wild and wooliness of history. I tell you that because I feel that's a little bit what like today's lesson or today's sermon is going to be like. You see, we are walking through the story of Samson. And it is a wild and crazy story, and it is not one that we get 5 clear life lessons out of. So let's just dive in and see where this takes us. Our story picks up here. Our own Jack Beck was kind enough to send me a couple of pictures. This is in southern Israel, and this is the valley where Samson's parents would have lived. You see, Samson's parents were childless. And one day, an angel appears first to the wife and then to both of them. And the angel says, behold, you are barren and you have not borne children, but you shall conceive and bear a son. And now, of course, this is big news because, first of all, an angel is showing up. And secondly, you're going to have kids. But this is where it gets really crazy. The angel says, no razor shall come upon his head, for this child shall be a Nazarite to God from the womb, and he shall save Israel. She'll begin to save Israel from the hand of the Philistines. Now, I want to unpack that for a little bit. There was what was called Nazarite vows, and this goes all the way up through the time of Jesus. And what that meant was you did a couple of things to signify that you were dedicating yourself for God for a time period. Usually it was just a time period. And what you would do is you wouldn't cut your hair and you wouldn't drink alcohol, and there was a few other things that you would do. But what God is saying is, Samson, this guy, from the time he's born, he's not going to touch alcohol and he's not going to cut his hair. And he's going to be the one who shall begin to save Israel from the hand of the Philistines. Now, here's what's going on. This is about 1,100 years, give or take, before Jesus. And it's in this Wild West period in the history of Israel. The people of Israel, God has taken them out of slavery, out of Egypt. They go through the Red Sea. They go through the wilderness, spend 40 years there. They get to the Promised Land. Now, for a couple hundred years from the time they get into the Promised Land until when God gives them the king, it's every man for himself. There's no central government. There's no powers that be. As the book of Judges puts it, everybody does right what they think is right in their own eyes. And we all know how well that goes. Okay. And as a consequence, they get encroached on. The Philistines and the Midianites and these other barbarian tribes settle into their land and push the Israelites around. So what God is saying is this kid, he's going to be set aside, and I'm going to use him to whack the Philistines around. Now, what we would expect is you think, okay, this guy is going to be set, he's going to be smart, he's going to be powerful, and he's going to outwit and outthink and outmaneuver the Philistines. Well, let's see what happens. So the next scene, the very next scene in the story, in the book of Judges, Samson is old enough to get married, and he says to his parents, hey, I saw this cute Philistine girl, I want to marry her. And his parents are like, you can't find a nice Israelite girl? There's some really nice girls in this valley. They're very sweet. And he's like, nope, she's cute, I want her. And that's about what he says. And so his parents are like, okay. Now, the story, when they wrote Judges, he puts it down, the author of Judges puts it down and says, God was using this because he wanted to punish the Philistines. And so what happens is Samson gets the marriage, or Samson's parents get the marriage arranged, and he ends up at the wedding feast. And the wedding feast was 7 days long. And while he's there, he starts he says to the people, his future in-laws, this Philistine village, he says, tell you what, I've got a riddle for you, and let's make a bet. If you can solve the riddle, you owe me 30 sets of clothes. And if you can solve the riddle, I owe you 30 sets of clothes, and if you can't, then you owe me 30 sets of clothes. And so the folks say, deal. And he tells them the riddle, and they can't figure it out. So eventually his bride-to-be comes to him with big teary eyes and says, Samson, you're embarrassing me in front of all my relatives, in front of my whole village. Can you just tell me what the answer is? And he tells her. And so, of course, she tells all of his in-laws, future in-laws to be, the whole village. And, of course, they say, okay, here's the answer. You owe us 30 sets of clothes. Now, Samson, naturally, is a little upset about this. And he says, okay, well, I guess I need to pay off this bet. Now, he doesn't, as one would expect, go down to the local Nordstrom's or Macy's or Target or Kohl's or whatever fine shopping clothing place that they have there. He goes over to the next Philistine village, kills 30 people, takes their clothes, comes back to his parents, dumps them down and says, boom, here you go, and storms off. Somebody asked me a couple of months ago, they were working through Genesis, and they said, what are we supposed to do with stories like this? They were asking about Lot and his daughters and that, but the same principle applies. Now, God is not advising you when he puts stories like this in the Bible. He's not putting them there to say, if you have to pay a bet, go kill off 30 people and steal their clothes. Okay? It might be biblical, but it is not recommended. There is a difference between descriptive and prescriptive. Descriptive is, this is what happened. Prescriptive is, this is what should happen. In this whole story of Samson, this is what happened. This is what's gone on. And I want to approach Samson as literature. Now, I'm not saying it's not history. It is firmly history. The whole book of Judges is written as history. But it is also art. And like any great piece of art, it asks us questions. And it makes us think. Now, what happens here with Samson is after he storms off, he comes back sometimes later, and he says to his father-in-law-to-be, who isn't the father of the bride, and says, I want to go see my wife now. And now we think of that, this is like, okay, this is weird. You stormed out of your own wedding and now you want the bride? There was some cultural stuff going on that just give it a pass for right now. I don't want to take 5 minutes and explain it. He wasn't as crazy as he would appear to our eyes. But the father of the bride says quite reasonably, well, you stormed out of the wedding, so we married her off to the best man. Yeah, exactly. This is not a good... Isn't this a fun story? And his father, the father of the bride, says, and I am not making this up, you can double check me in the text, and says, she's already married off, but I have another daughter who's younger and prettier. We'd be happy to have you marry her. And Samson's like, no, I had my heart set on that girl. Samson has a real woman problem. And not so much the women who are the problem, I think it's him. So Samson then goes next. He's like, I'm going to take it out on these Philistines. I've decided that I've had enough of them. So what he does is he catches a bunch of foxes, ties torches to their tails, lights the torches, and releases them in the Philistines' grain fields. Now, when you're talking subsistence level farming, this is an act of war. Because it's not like these folks can go over to the Piggly Wiggly and get more food to get through winter. It's like what you harvest is what you eat. And if you got a bad harvest, you ain't got nothing. So, here's where the story gets really interesting. The Philistines go to the Israelites and say, look, you got to give this guy up. If you don't give this guy up, we're going to kill you all, and then we're going to go find him and kill him. So, are we going to do it the easy way or the hard way? So the Israelites go to Samson and they say, we need to hand you over to the Philistines. Otherwise, they're going to kill all of us. And I want you to think for a second. This is what I meant by great art asking us great questions. What would you have done if you were part of the Israelites at that point? Because it's easy to say, well, we would have stood up and fought rather than let this guy go to his death. But it's also, you'd be sitting there thinking, well, he did kill 30 people for their clothes and he burnt all their grain, so it's not like they're coming out of nowhere on this. It's asked us that question. We read through these stories. I want you to think about those kind of things. Where would I see myself in this? What decision would I have made? So the Israelites go to Samson and they say, we need to tie you up and hand you over to the Philistines. And Samson says, okay, you got to promise you're not going to kill me. And the Israelites are like, we promise. We are totally not going to kill you. We are going to tie you up, hand you over to the Philistines, and they're going to kill you. I'm not joking. That's what it says. And Samson's like, cool. Hold my beer. And it's like, oh, wait, no, he doesn't drink alcohol. Hold my Culvers. Okay. And so they tie him up. They hand him over. And as it says, when they hand him over, it's like the ropes tying him up became like burnt flax, and they just melt away. And he kills 1,000 Philistines that day with the jawbone of a donkey. And from this point on, Samson is the boogeyman for the Philistines. He's the ghost story that they tell around the campfire. He's the one that everybody is afraid of. And we get this constant thing of going back and forth of the Philistines trying to kill him and trying to trap him. And each time he slips out of the trap, and each time more Philistines end up dead. Until we meet Delilah. Now, it says, and I find this really interesting, in chapter 16, after this, he loved a woman in the valley of Sorek, whose name was Delilah. Now, if you read this chapter, you will see very clearly that he loved Delilah. And if you read very clearly, it says nothing at all about how she feels about him. So the Philistines come to Delilah, and they say, we will back up the money truck for you. We will give you piles and piles of silver if you can figure out how to get this guy dead. And so she says to Samson, as we just heard Sandy read, please tell me your great strength, how you might be bound, that no one could subdue you. And you'd think that question in and of itself would raise some red flags. You'd think something would happen in that brain of his, like, maybe she wants to hurt me. Okay? So at first he tells her, he lies to her and says, well, if anybody ties me up with 7 fresh bowstrings, I'll be as weak as anybody else. So he falls asleep. They tie him up. And she says, Samson, wake up, the Philistines are upon you. And he snaps the bowstrings and kills all the Philistines. Again. How much did they have to pay those Philistines? Because it's like, hope they got a good life insurance policy. And this goes on and on a couple of times. He says, tie me up with new ropes. If anybody braids my hair, and goes on. And each time the same thing happens. Until finally, he gives in and tells her. And again, it's one of those great questions that the story asks us. What got him to this point where he just says, oh yeah, here's my secret. If anybody shaves my head, if I don't have my hair, I'm as weak as anybody else. What made him give in? And again, it asks us that great question. What is our kryptonite? For Samson, it was these women. There's another one in the story too I haven't even had time for. What is it that gives him this weakness? He can't resist. What is it that makes Delilah have such power over him? And if we're honest, we know there's things in our own life that do the same thing. So sure enough, and this is one of those where you just have to admire whoever put this story together. I mean, it was handed down and then it was put together. And we don't know who the author of Judges is. But the way he tells the story is Samson falls asleep with his head on Delilah's lap, and she calls in a servant, and that servant shaves Samson's head, and they tie him up. And the Philistines burst in, and he goes to get up, and he finds he's as weak as any normal, mortal human being. And they gouge out his eyes, and they throw him in jail. Throw him in prison. Now, the story doesn't end there. He's in prison for a while, and his hair starts to grow back. And the way the text puts it, it's actually in the text that as his hair grows back, his strength comes back too. And it's not that his strength comes from the hair per se, but it's from this vow, from this relationship with God. And so as his hair comes out, he gets stronger and stronger again. And one day, the Philistines decide they are going to have a party. And this is a picture, artist rendering of their drawing. Again, Jack Beck was kind enough to send me this drawing. It's actually reconstructed from a dig in the area. It's not the one that Samson would have been at, but it was the same style. And you can see there's central pillars there that hold up everything. And so what happens is they decide they're going to have fun, and they're going to bring Samson to the center of the temple, and they are going to chain him up there, and they're going to make fun of him and throw things at him, and have a little sport. So as they do this, Samson calls out to God and says, "Oh, Lord God, please remember me, and please strengthen me only this once, O God, that I may be avenged on the Philistines for my 2 eyes." Now it's interesting that Samson says, "For my eyes," not for what they've done to my people, not for defiling this land, not for oppressing the Israelites, but it's like, they took this from me and I want to punish them. I'd be blind. I'd be mad too if somebody blinded me. I think one of the things that I see constantly in this story is God uses imperfect vessels, imperfect people. And it's not, the story isn't saying, be like Samson. He's saying, the story is saying, understand imperfect people still have a purpose with our flaws and our brokenness. And so Samson, as they chain him up, he says, let me die with the Philistines. Then he bowed with all his strength, and the house fell upon the lords and all the people who were in it. And so the dead he killed in his death were more than he had killed in his life. He takes those pillars that hold up the temple and pulls them all down and pulls down the whole temple, everybody in it, kills the lot of them. And it's interesting, the way the story is told in Judges, there's a little line, a little tag at the end, which I never caught until I was doing the work this week. That Samson's brother and his family come down to collect the body and go bury it. Here is this guy who's been this terror, this Godzilla to the Philistines, and not exactly the most righteous person or smartest person you would expect. But in this, his family still loves him. His people still care for them. Usually I end sermons with a couple of questions, a couple of things for you to think about, a couple of things for you to pray about. I'm not going to do that today. Because this story of Samson is so different for each and every one of us. And what I want to ask you to do instead is go back and read it. It's only 3 or 4 chapters long. Like I said, it picks up in Judges chapter 13 and ends in Judges 16. It's 3 chapters. It'll take you 10 to 15 minutes to read it. But go through it and ask yourself, what is this saying to me? Because like any great and enduring piece of art, it asks us these questions. And it lets us see into ourselves through God's truth. You don't want to be like Samson, but you want to learn from him. Because God used him. God uses all of us, imperfect as we are. Amen.